Picture this. A warrior goddess springs fully grown from her father's skull, armored and ready for battle. She doesn't cry as an infant. She shrieks a war cry that shakes the very foundations of Olympus. This is Athena, and her story isn't just about wisdom or warfare. It's about a divine being who could grant victory to heroes one moment and curse them to madness the next. Before we launch ourselves into the world of Athena, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time is it for you right now. Whether you're tuning in at midnight under a canopy of stars, or at dawn as the first light touches your window, it's lovely to have you here. If you enjoy these peaceful explorations through Greek mythology, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps the Pantheon Chronicles grow, and it means more curious souls like you can drift off with minds full of gentle marvel. Now, settle in. We're about to explore the goddess who embodied both the highest ideals of civilization and its most ruthless necessities. The ancient Greeks didn't see their gods as distant, perfect beings. They saw them as powerful, flawed, and intensely involved in mortal affairs. Among all the Olympians, perhaps none was more complex than Athena, a goddess who could inspire the greatest works of art and the most devastating strategies of war, sometimes in the same breath. Tonight, we're going to walk through her story, from beginning to end. We'll witness her extraordinary birth, follow her as she shapes the fate of heroes and cities, and discover how she became both protector and destroyer, wise counselor and merciless judge. This isn't just the story of a goddess. It's the story of how the ancient world understood the relationship between wisdom and power, between civilization and savagery. We'll meet her in the halls of Olympus, walk beside her on the plains of Troy, and stand with her in the great city that bore her name. We'll see her at her most generous, granting gifts that would change the world forever, and at her most terrible, unleashing vengeance that would echo through generations. The fire is burning low, the night is deep, and the ancient stories are calling. Let's begin. Long before there was light, before there was order, there was chaos. And from chaos came the first gods, the Titans, who ruled the world with the raw power of natural forces. Among them was Kronos, who devoured his own children to prevent them from overthrowing him, just as he had overthrown his father. But Zeus, the youngest son, escaped this fate. Hidden away and raised in secret, he grew strong enough to challenge his father. The war that followed, the Titanomachy, shook the very foundations of existence. When Zeus finally emerged victorious, he didn't make his father's mistake. He was careful about the prophecies, careful about potential threats to his rule. That's what made his relationship with Metis so dangerous. Metis was a Titaness, one of the few who had sided with Zeus during the war. She was the personification of cunning intelligence, of wisdom that could see through deception and around corners. She was beautiful, yes, but her true allure lay in her mind, sharp as a blade, deep as the ocean, and absolutely essential to Zeus's victory. They became lovers, and soon Metis was pregnant. But the fates had spoken a prophecy that chilled Zeus to the bone. Metis would bear 2 children. The first, a daughter, would be mighty but loyal. The second, a son, would be mightier still, mighty enough to overthrow his father, just as Zeus had overthrown Kronos, and Kronos had overthrown Uranus before him. Zeus faced a choice that would define not just his reign, but the nature of divine wisdom itself. He chose violence, There are different versions of how it happened. Some say he tricked Métis into becoming small and swallowed her whole. Others say he simply opened his mouth and she disappeared into his being. But the result was the same. Métis, the goddess of wisdom, was consumed by the king of the gods. You might think that would be the end of the story, but wisdom, once awakened, cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. For months, Zeus felt her moving inside him. Not just the child, Métis herself, alive and thinking, her consciousness merged with his, but never conquered. She whispered to him, advised him, became part of his decision-making process. The king of the gods had literally internalized wisdom, but the child was growing too. The pain began slowly, like a distant storm. Then it intensified, becoming a pounding that seemed to shake Zeus's very skull. The other gods watched with growing concern as their king clutched his head, his face twisted in agony. The pain was so intense that it seemed to crack the sky itself. Finally, Zeus could bear it no longer. He called for Hephaestus, the god of smiths and crafts, and commanded him to split open his skull. Hephaestus raised his axe, his face grim with the knowledge of what he was about to do. The blow fell, and Zeus's head split open like a cracked egg. What emerged was not a helpless infant, but a fully grown goddess, armored in gleaming bronze, her grey eyes bright with intelligence, her spear raised high. She let out a war cry that shook Olympus, and the very earth trembled at the sound. This was Athena, born not from love or passion, but from the marriage of raw power and pure wisdom. She was her father's daughter in every way that mattered: his intelligence, his strategic mind, his ability to see the bigger picture. But she was also her mother's child, carrying within her the cunning and insight that had made Métis indispensable. From the moment of her birth, Athena was different from the other gods. She had never been helpless, never been vulnerable. She had never known childhood or innocence. She sprang into existence as a fully formed adult, with all the knowledge and wisdom of her mother flowing through her mind. The other gods looked upon her with a mixture of awe and fear. Here was a goddess who could outthink them, outfight them, and outmaneuver them, and she was unquestionably loyal to Zeus. In creating her, the king of the gods had solved his problem perfectly. He had the wisdom he needed, embodied in a daughter who would never betray him. But in the ancient world, perfect solutions often carried the seeds of unexpected complications, and Athena, for all her wisdom, was about to discover that being born from the marriage of power and intelligence came with its own unique burden. She would have to learn to navigate a world where her very existence was a reminder of violence, where her wisdom was forever tainted by the way it had been obtained. She would have to find her place among gods who had been born naturally, who had known childhood and growth and the gradual acquisition of their powers. Most importantly, she would have to decide what kind of goddess she wanted to be. Would she be like her father, ruling through power and intimidation? Or would she find another way, a path that honored both her mother's wisdom and her own unique nature? The grey-eyed goddess stood on Olympus, her spear gleaming in the divine light, and began to consider her options. In the early days of the world, the gods didn't simply claim their domains. They earned them through action, through the choices they made and the gifts they gave. Athena, born with the wisdom of Métis and the power of Zeus, could have chosen any path. She could have been a goddess of pure thought, dwelling in ivory towers and contemplating abstract truths. She could have been a force of nature, unleashing divine power without concern for mortal consequences. Instead, she chose to be practical. The first thing that marked Athena as different was her approach to warfare. The Greeks had other war gods, Ares, for instance, who reveled in the chaos and bloodshed of battle. But Athena looked at war with the clear, calculating eyes of a strategist. She saw not just the violence, but the purpose behind it. She understood that war was not just about killing, but about achieving objectives, protecting what mattered, and establishing order from chaos. This distinction would define her for millennia to come. Where Ares was the god of warriors who fought for the joy of fighting, Athena became the goddess of soldiers who fought for something greater than themselves. She was the divine force behind every careful plan, every strategic retreat, every victory won through intelligence rather than brute strength. But her interest in warfare was just one facet of her nature. Athena was drawn to anything that required skill, patience, and the transformation of raw materials into something beautiful and useful. She became the patroness of crafts, not because she was particularly artistic, but because she understood that true creation required both vision and technique. Watch her fingers as she works the loom, and you'll see something remarkable. She doesn't just weave thread into cloth. She weaves stories, patterns that tell tales of heroes and gods, of victories and defeats. Each thread is placed with purpose, each color chosen for its meaning. The tapestry that emerges is not just functional, but beautiful. Not just beautiful, but meaningful. This was Athena's gift to the world, the understanding that intelligence and beauty were not opposites, but partners. That the highest form of wisdom was not abstract thought, but the practical application of knowledge to create something better than what came before. She taught mortals to spin wool into thread, to weave thread into cloth, to build homes that would shelter them from the elements. She showed them how to tame horses, not through violence, but through understanding. She guided their hands as they learned to work metal, to shape clay, to create tools that would make their lives easier and more productive. But perhaps her greatest gift was the olive tree. The story goes that Athena and Poseidon both wanted to be the patron deity of a great city in Attica. The contest was simple. Each god would present a gift to the people, and the people would choose which gift was more valuable. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, and a spring of water burst forth. It was impressive, certainly, but when the people tasted the water, they found it was salt water, useless for drinking or irrigation. Athena's gift was more subtle. She planted a seed in the ground, and from it grew the first olive tree. The people looked at it with confusion at first. What was this strange plant? But Athena showed them how to press the olives for oil, how to preserve the fruit, how to use the wood for construction. She had given them not just food, but light, medicine, and materials for building. The people chose Athena, and the city took her name, Athens. This story reveals something fundamental about Athena's character. She wasn't interested in flashy demonstrations of power. She was interested in gifts that would endure, that would improve lives not just in the moment, but for generations to come. The olive tree would outlast empires, would feed families for thousands of years, would become the symbol of peace and prosperity throughout the Mediterranean world. But Athena's wisdom extended beyond practical matters. She became the goddess of just warfare, the divine force that helped heroes distinguish between fighting for good reasons and fighting for bad ones. She was the voice that whispered strategy in the ears of generals, the inspiration that struck inventors and artists, the steady hand that guided lawmakers as they tried to create societies that were both strong and fair. Yet even as she embraced these roles, Athena never forgot where she came from. She carried within her the memory of her mother's fate, the knowledge that wisdom could be dangerous, that intelligence could be threatening to those in power. She learned to navigate the treacherous waters of divine politics, to be useful without being threatening, to be powerful without being seen as a rival. This balancing act would define her existence. She would be the goddess who helped heroes achieve greatness, but who also punished those who overstepped their bounds. She would be the protector of cities, but also the force that could destroy them if they became too proud. She would be the embodiment of wisdom, but also the reminder that wisdom without restraint could become its own form of folly. As she established her domains and learned her role in the cosmic order, Athena was becoming something unprecedented, a goddess of contradictions who somehow made those contradictions work. She was war and peace, creation and destruction, mercy and justice, all bound together by the thread of practical wisdom. And the world was watching, waiting to see what she would do with all that power. There's something that happens when a mortal catches the attention of a god. Not worship. That's different. That's distant. This is personal interest, the kind that changes destinies and reshapes the world. Throughout the ages, Athena developed a particular fondness for heroes, not because they were perfect, but because they were trying to be better than they were. Her first great protege was Perseus, the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Danae. Perseus had been given an impossible task: to kill Medusa, the Gorgon, whose gaze could turn any living thing to stone. It was the kind of challenge that seemed designed to end in failure, the kind of quest that kings assigned to young men they wanted to see dead. But Perseus had caught Athena's attention, and when Athena decided to help someone, she didn't do it halfway. She appeared to him in the form of an old woman, her grey eyes twinkling with hidden knowledge. "The task is dangerous," she told him, "but not impossible. You'll need more than courage, young prince. You'll need wisdom." She gave him a shield, polished to mirror brightness, and taught him the secret that would save his life. Never look at Medusa directly. Use the reflection. Let her own terrible beauty be the weapon that defeats her. It was classic Athena, not just providing divine power, but teaching the hero how to think his way through the problem. Perseus succeeded, not because he was stronger than Medusa, but because he was smarter. He used the shield to see her reflection, approached her while she slept, and struck with perfect precision. But that was just the beginning of their relationship. When Perseus flew home on his winged sandals, he found his mother being threatened by a cruel king who wanted to force her into marriage. The king had gathered his supporters in a great hall, and they laughed when Perseus burst through the doors, demanding they release his mother. "And what will you do to stop us, boy?" the king sneered. Perseus smiled and pulled Medusa's head from his bag. "I'll show you something beautiful," he said, and turned the entire court to stone. Later, when Perseus had no more use for the Gorgon's head, he offered it to Athena. She accepted it gladly and placed it on her shield, the aegis, where it would remain for all eternity. It was a perfect symbol of her philosophy, that even the most terrible things could be transformed into tools of justice, that wisdom could turn curse into blessing. But Perseus was just the beginning. Athena's most famous protege was Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, whose story would be told for thousands of years. Odysseus was not the strongest hero, nor the most beautiful, nor the most skilled with a sword. What made him special was his mind, quick, adaptable, always looking for the angle that others missed. He was, in many ways, the perfect mortal reflection of Athena herself. Their relationship began during the Trojan War, that great conflict that would define Greek mythology for generations. The war had been raging for 10 years, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Greeks had the greater army, but Troy had stronger walls and better defenses. It was a stalemate that seemed likely to continue forever. That's when Odysseus came to Athena with an idea. "We can't take the city by force," he told her. "But what if we didn't have to? What if we could make them open the gates for us?" The plan they developed together was audacious in its simplicity. The Greeks would build a massive wooden horse, hollow inside, and hide their best warriors within it. The rest of the army would sail away, leaving the horse as an apparent offering to the gods. When the Trojans brought it inside their walls as a trophy, the hidden warriors would emerge and open the gates for the returning Greek fleet. It was a plan that required perfect timing, absolute trust, and the kind of coordinated deception that only a goddess of wisdom could orchestrate. Athena guided every step of the construction, whispered strategy to Odysseus, and ensured that each piece of the elaborate deception fell into place. The plan worked flawlessly. Troy fell in a single night, ending the greatest war in Greek history. But for Odysseus, this victory was just the beginning of his troubles. His journey home to Ithaca became an epic in its own right. 10 years of wandering, facing monsters and gods, natural disasters and divine curses. Through it all, Athena remained his constant companion, sometimes visible, sometimes working behind the scenes. She was there when he blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, whispering the strategy that would save his life. She was there when he resisted the song of the sirens, helping him devise the plan to hear their music without being destroyed by it. She was there when he faced the witch Circe, when he journeyed to the underworld, when he navigated between the monsters Scylla and Charybdis. But perhaps her greatest intervention came at the very end of his journey, when Odysseus finally reached Ithaca to find his palace overrun with suitors trying to force his wife Penelope into marriage. These men had been eating his food, drinking his wine, and abusing his hospitality for years, confident that Odysseus was dead. Athena helped him plan his revenge with the same careful attention to detail that had brought down Troy. She disguised him as a beggar, allowing him to move through his own palace unrecognized. She guided his hand as he strung his great bow, the weapon that only he could wield, and she stood beside him as he unleashed his vengeance upon the suitors, turning his own hall into a battlefield. The slaughter was complete and terrible. When it was over, Odysseus stood surrounded by the bodies of men who had thought themselves safe in his home. It was justice, but it was also a reminder of Athena's nature, that wisdom and mercy could coexist with ruthless efficiency. But Athena's influence on heroes went beyond individual relationships. She was the goddess who taught them to think strategically, to consider consequences, to understand that true strength came not from muscle or rage, but from the ability to see clearly and act decisively. She favored heroes who used their minds, who solved problems through cleverness rather than brute force. She was drawn to those who protected the innocent, who fought for justice rather than glory, who understood that victory was meaningless unless it served a greater purpose. This is why her heroes were remembered not just for their strength, but for their wisdom. They were the ones who founded cities, who established laws, who created things that would outlast their own lives. They were the ones who understood that true heroism wasn't about personal glory, but about making the world a better place. And in each of them, we can see a reflection of Athena herself, practical, strategic, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always considering how today's actions would affect tomorrow's world. The grey-eyed goddess was shaping not just individual destinies, but the very concept of what it meant to be a hero. Not all of Athena's stories end with triumph and glory. Sometimes, the grey-eyed goddess revealed a darker side to her nature, a reminder that wisdom without compassion could become its own form of cruelty. The story of Arachne is one such tale, and it shows us what happened when mortal pride met divine jealousy. Arachne was born in the kingdom of Lydia, in a small town where the sound of looms filled the air from dawn to dusk. Her father was a dyer, skilled in his craft, but hardly wealthy. They lived a simple life, but Arachne possessed a gift that would make her famous throughout the ancient world. She could weave like no mortal before her. Her fingers seemed to dance across the loom, pulling threads into patterns so intricate, so beautiful, that people traveled from distant lands just to see her work. The tapestries she created were more than mere cloth. They were windows into other worlds, stories told in silk and gold, emotions captured in the interplay of color and texture. The people who watched her work began to whisper that surely the gods had blessed her hands. Surely Athena herself had taught her these skills. But Arachne, young and proud and intoxicated by her own talent, made a mistake that would cost her everything. "The goddess taught me nothing," she declared to a crowd of admirers. "My skill is my own, earned through years of practice and dedication. I need no divine help to create beauty." The crowd gasped at her boldness, but Arachne wasn't finished. "In fact," she continued, her voice carrying across the marketplace, "I challenge Athena herself to a contest. Let her come down from Olympus and match her skill against mine. We'll see who truly deserves to be called the greatest weaver in the world." Words like these have a way of traveling quickly, especially when they're spoken with such confidence. Within days, the story had spread throughout the region. Within weeks, it had reached the ears of the gods themselves. Athena heard the challenge and felt something she rarely experienced: genuine anger. Not the strategic anger she employed in warfare, but the personal, burning fury of someone whose expertise has been questioned by an upstart. She could have simply struck Arachne dead with lightning, or cursed her to madness, or wiped her from existence with a thought. But that would have been too easy, too crude. Athena was a goddess of wisdom, and she knew that the most effective lessons were often the most subtle ones. Instead, she decided to give Arachne a chance to reconsider. She appeared in the town disguised as an old woman, bent with age, her grey hair covered by a simple shawl. She made her way to Arachne's workshop, where the young woman was working on a tapestry that depicted the marriage of Zeus and Hera. "Your work is beautiful, child," the old woman said, her voice cracked with age. "But I've lived long enough to know that pride comes before a fall. Perhaps you should reconsider your challenge to the goddess. Athena is not known for her mercy toward those who insult her." Arachne looked up from her loom, her eyes flashing with annoyance. "Who are you to give me advice, old woman?" "I stand by my words. If Athena wants to prove her superiority, let her come here and do it." The old woman's eyes, grey as storm clouds, fixed on Arachne's face. "Very well," she said quietly. "Your wish is granted." The disguise fell away like morning mist, revealing the goddess in all her terrible glory. Athena stood before Arachne, her armor gleaming, her spear held ready, her aegis bearing the head of Medusa. The workshop fell silent, except for the whisper of thread in the wind. "You wanted a contest," Athena said, her voice carrying the authority of divine power. "You shall have one. We will each weave a tapestry, and let the world judge which is superior. But know this, mortal. If you lose, the consequences will be severe." Arachne, to her credit, didn't back down. Fear flickered in her eyes, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I accept your challenge, goddess. Let us see who truly deserves to be called the greatest weaver." What followed was the most extraordinary contest in the history of the craft. 2 looms were set up side by side, and both goddess and mortal began to work. Athena's tapestry was a masterpiece of divine propaganda. She wove the story of her contest with Poseidon for the patronage of Athens, showing herself as the wise and beneficent goddess who had given mortals the gift of the olive tree. Around the borders, she depicted the punishments that had befallen mortals who had dared to challenge the gods. A reminder, perhaps, of what awaited those who forgot their place. The work was technically perfect. Every thread was placed with mathematical precision, every color chosen for maximum impact. It was beautiful, powerful, and completely in keeping with what people expected from the goddess of wisdom and craft. But Arachne's tapestry was something else, entirely. She wove the loves of the gods, but not the sanitized, heroic versions that were usually told. She showed Zeus transforming into a bull to rape Europa, into a swan to assault Leda, into a shower of gold to impregnate Danae. She depicted Poseidon's violent pursuit of Demeter, Apollo's harassment of Daphne, the countless ways that divine power had been used to harm and exploit mortals. It was a tapestry of accusation, a work of art that revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of divine justice, and it was absolutely, heartbreakingly beautiful. When both weavers finished their work, a crowd had gathered to witness the judgment. They looked at Athena's tapestry and saw technical perfection, divine majesty, the kind of beauty that inspired awe and reverence. Then they looked at Arachne's work, and they saw something that made them catch their breath. Here was beauty that spoke to the heart, that revealed truth instead of hiding it, that transformed pain into something transcendent. Even Athena, staring at her rival's work, had to admit that it was flawless. The technique was perfect, the artistry sublime. She could find no fault with the craftsmanship, no weakness to exploit. But that only made her angrier. "You dare to mock the gods?" she hissed, her grey eyes blazing with fury. "You use your skill to spread lies and slander about those who are your betters?" "I use my skill to tell the truth," Arachne replied, her voice steady despite the terror she must have felt. "If that troubles you, perhaps you should examine your own actions." It was the last thing she would ever say as a human being. Athena raised her hand, and divine power flowed from her fingers like liquid fire. But instead of destroying Arachne, she transformed her. The young woman's body began to change, shrinking and darkening. Her arms became legs, her fingers became spinnerets, her beautiful eyes became the cold, multifaceted eyes of a spider. "You love to weave so much," Athena said, her voice terrible in its calm. "Then weave you shall, for all eternity. You and all your descendants will spin and weave until the end of time, but you will never again create anything of beauty or meaning." And so Arachne became the first spider, condemned to weave webs that would trap and kill, to create only instruments of death instead of works of art. Her story became a warning about the dangers of challenging the gods, but also a reminder of the tragic cost of divine pride. The grey-eyed goddess looked at what she had done, and for a moment, something like regret flickered in her eyes. But it was too late. The transformation was complete, and Arachne was lost forever. Some say that in the darkness of caves, where spiders spin their webs, you can still hear the echo of that first contest. The sound of thread being pulled into patterns, of stories being told in silk and shadow. And sometimes, if you look closely at a spider's web in the morning light, you might see something that looks almost like art, a reminder of what was lost when pride met pride, and wisdom forgot mercy. The lesson was clear. Even the gods of wisdom were not immune to the very human flaw of jealousy, and sometimes the greatest tragedies occurred not when evil triumphed over good, but when two forms of excellence could not coexist. The Trojan War had been over for years, but its aftermath continued to ripple through the world like stones thrown into still water. Heroes who had survived the siege found themselves facing challenges that were in some ways more difficult than anything they had encountered on the battlefield. The return home was proving to be its own kind of war, and not everyone would survive it. Among the greatest of the Greek heroes was Ajax the Great, son of Telamon, a man whose strength and courage had become legendary, even among legends. He was huge, powerful, and utterly fearless in combat. While other heroes fought with divine weapons or magical protection, Ajax needed only his massive shield and his own tremendous strength. He was the kind of warrior who could hold a line against impossible odds, who could face down gods and monsters with nothing but his own determination. During the war, Ajax had been Achilles' closest friend and most trusted companion. They had fought side by side through countless battles, saved each other's lives more times than either could count. When Achilles fell, struck down by Paris's arrow, it was Ajax who carried his body from the battlefield, fighting off the Trojans who tried to strip the corpse of its divine armor. That armor, forged by Hephaestus himself, gleaming with otherworldly beauty, became the center of a dispute that would destroy one of the greatest heroes of the age. The Greek leaders decided that the armor should go to whoever had contributed most to the war effort. It came down to two candidates: Ajax, whose strength and loyalty had been unwavering throughout the conflict, and Odysseus, whose cunning and strategic mind had ultimately won the war. The debate was fierce. Ajax's supporters pointed to his countless acts of bravery, his willingness to face any danger, his absolute loyalty to his comrades. He had never once retreated from battle, never once failed to answer a call for help. When other heroes had been wounded or fallen, Ajax had been there, his great shield protecting the retreat, his sword carving a path through enemy lines. But Odysseus's supporters had their own arguments. Yes, Ajax was strong and brave, but the war had been won through intelligence, not brute force. It was Odysseus who had conceived the plan for the wooden horse, Odysseus who had infiltrated enemy lines, Odysseus who had negotiated with allies and coordinated the complex strategies that had brought victory. When the vote was taken, Odysseus won by a narrow margin. Ajax received the news in silence, his face showing nothing of the storm that was building inside him. He had expected the armor to be his by right, had assumed that his years of service and sacrifice would be recognized. The decision felt like a betrayal, not just by the Greek leaders, but by the very concept of justice itself. That night, as the camp slept, Ajax made a decision that would have horrified his friends if they had known what he was planning. He would have his revenge on those who had wronged him, starting with Odysseus and the leaders who had voted against him. He armed himself with sword and spear, his face set in grim determination. But as he made his way through the camp, Athena was watching. The gray-eyed goddess had her own complicated feelings about what had happened. She had favored Odysseus, had helped him win the contest, but she also respected Ajax's courage and loyalty. She didn't want to see him destroyed, but she couldn't allow him to massacre his own allies in a fit of wounded pride. So she did something that would haunt her for the rest of eternity. She sent madness upon Ajax, clouding his mind so that he couldn't tell friend from foe, reality from illusion. In his deranged state, he began to see the sheep and cattle of the camp as his enemies. He fell upon them with his sword, slaughtering them with the same efficiency he had once brought to battle against the Trojans. For hours Ajax fought his phantom enemies, his sword rising and falling, his war cries echoing through the night. He dragged what he thought was Odysseus back to his tent, bound what he imagined were the Greek leaders, and prepared to torture them for their betrayal. When dawn came, the madness lifted. Ajax found himself standing in his tent, covered in blood, surrounded by the butchered carcasses of livestock. The sheep he had thought was Odysseus lay dead at his feet. The cattle he had imagined were his enemies were scattered around him, their blood pooling on the ground. The realization of what he had done hit him like a physical blow. He had not won a glorious victory over his enemies. He had slaughtered innocent animals in a fit of madness. He had become a figure of ridicule, a joke that would be told around campfires for generations. But worse than the shame was the knowledge that his mind had been taken from him. Ajax had always prided himself on his clarity of thought, his ability to see situations clearly and act decisively. Now he understood that even that could be stripped away, that he was as vulnerable to divine manipulation as any mortal. He stood in the doorway of his tent as the sun rose, watching his fellow warriors discover what he had done. Some laughed, some shook their heads in pity, some simply stared in disbelief. The great Ajax, the hero who had never retreated, had been reduced to a madman who fought sheep. His wife Tecmessa found him there, her face filled with concern and love. "Come inside," she said softly. "This will pass. People will remember your great deeds, not this single night of madness." But Ajax knew better. He had lived his entire life according to a code of honor that demanded excellence, courage, and dignity. He had prided himself on being a man others could depend on, a warrior who never failed in his duty. Now he was something else, a broken man, a figure of pity and ridicule. He looked at his wife, at his young son playing nearby, and felt something break inside him. They deserved better than this. They deserved a husband and father they could be proud of, not a madman who had lost his mind over a piece of armor. "I know what I have to do," he said quietly. Tecmessa understood immediately. She fell to her knees, grasping his hands. "No," she whispered. "Please no. Think of your son. Think of me. We need you. We love you." Ajax gently pulled his hands free. "You love the man I was," he said. "That man is dead. What's left is just a shell, a joke for others to laugh at. I won't live as a mockery of my former self." He asked her to leave him alone for a while, to take their son and give him time to think. Tecmessa, perhaps hoping he would come to his senses, reluctantly agreed. When they were gone, Ajax took his sword, the same weapon that had served him so faithfully throughout the war, and planted it in the ground, point upward. He knelt before it, his hands resting on the pommel, and spoke his final words to the world. "I have lived with honor," he said, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "I have served my friends, protected my family, and fought for what I believed was right. I will not live without honor. I will not become a shadow of the man I once was." He thought of all the battles he had fought, all the friends he had saved, all the moments of glory and triumph. He thought of Achilles, waiting for him in the underworld, and wondered if his friend would understand what he was about to do. Then, with the same decisiveness he had shown in battle, Ajax threw himself forward onto his sword. The blade pierced his heart instantly. The great hero, who had survived countless battles and faced down the most terrible enemies, died alone in his tent, brought low not by enemy action, but by the manipulation of the goddess he had served faithfully throughout the war. When Tecmessa found his body, her screams brought the entire camp running. The greatest warriors of the age stood in stunned silence, looking down at the fallen hero. They had expected Ajax to live forever, to be one of those legendary figures who somehow survived everything the world could throw at them. But Athena, watching from Olympus, felt something she had rarely experienced before: genuine regret. She had meant to save Ajax from his own anger, to prevent him from committing an act that would have destroyed his reputation forever. Instead, she had driven him to a different kind of destruction, one that was perhaps even more tragic. The grey-eyed goddess had learned a hard lesson about the limits of divine intervention. Sometimes, in trying to protect mortals from themselves, the gods only made things worse. Sometimes, the cure was more deadly than the disease. Ajax's death sent shock waves through the Greek camp. Here was a hero who had never been defeated in battle, who had faced gods and monsters without flinching, brought down by shame and madness. If someone like Ajax could fall, what hope did any of them have? But perhaps more importantly, Ajax's death served as a reminder that even the greatest heroes were still mortal, still vulnerable to the same emotions and frailties that affected ordinary people. Courage in battle didn't necessarily translate to resilience in the face of humiliation. Strength of body didn't always mean strength of spirit. The armor that had caused all this tragedy was eventually given to Odysseus, who accepted it with none of the joy he had felt when he first won the contest. He had gained divine armor, but he had lost a friend and ally whose like would never be seen again. Years later, when Odysseus told the story of his wanderings, he always spoke of Ajax with deep respect and sorrow. He knew that the contest had been fairly won, but he also knew that the cost of victory had been far higher than anyone had anticipated. And in the halls of Olympus, Athena carried the memory of Ajax's death like a wound that would never heal. She had acted with the best of intentions, but she had learned that good intentions were not enough. The responsibility of divine power was heavier than even she had imagined. The grey-eyed goddess would be more careful in the future, more thoughtful about the consequences of her actions. But Ajax was gone, and no amount of regret could bring him back. His story became a warning about the dangers of pride, but also about the tragic cost of divine intervention. Sometimes, the gods' attempts to help only made things worse. Sometimes, the greatest kindness was to let mortals face their struggles alone, to succeed or fail on their own terms. The blood of heroes had watered the ground of Troy, but it seemed that the real tragedy was only beginning. The war was over, but the gods were still playing their games, and mortals were still paying the price. Long after the great age of heroes had passed, long after Troy had fallen, and the Greek ships had sailed home, Athena's influence continued to shape the world in ways both subtle and profound. The goddess of wisdom found herself drawn to mortals who sought knowledge, who asked the right questions, who understood that true intelligence was not about knowing everything, but about knowing how to think. But not all of these encounters went as expected. There was a young man in Athens, centuries after the city had been named in her honor, who had gained a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions. His name was Socrates, and he had developed a peculiar habit of approaching people who were considered wise or important and asking them to define concepts that everyone assumed they understood. What is justice? He would ask a judge. What is courage? He would ask a general. What is beauty? He would ask an artist. And invariably, the person would discover that they couldn't provide a satisfactory answer. They knew these things existed, could recognize them when they saw them, but couldn't actually explain what they were. Socrates would continue asking questions, probing deeper, until his conversation partner was forced to admit that they didn't really know what they were talking about. This had made him extremely unpopular with the city's elite, but it had also attracted a devoted following of young people who were fascinated by his method of inquiry. They called him the wisest man in Athens, though Socrates himself claimed to know nothing. Athena, watching from her position as the city's patron goddess, was intrigued. Here was a mortal who seemed to understand something fundamental about the nature of wisdom, that it began with recognizing one's own ignorance. She decided to pay him a visit. She appeared to him as an old woman, just as she had to Arachne, though this time her intentions were more benevolent. She found him in the agora, sitting in the shade of a plane tree, surrounded by his usual group of young followers. "Teacher," she said, using the term that had become his informal title, "I have heard that you are the wisest man in Athens. Can you tell me what wisdom is?" Socrates looked up at her with the bright, curious eyes that had made him famous. "Ah, grandmother, you ask the question that has puzzled me for years. The oracle at Delphi once told a friend of mine that I was the wisest man in Athens, but I know that I am not wise at all. So I have spent my life trying to understand what she meant. And what have you discovered? That most people think they know things they do not actually know. They have opinions, beliefs, assumptions, but they have never examined these things carefully. They mistake familiarity for understanding, confidence for knowledge." Athena nodded approvingly. "And you are different. Only in that I recognize my ignorance. I know that I don't know. This may be the beginning of wisdom, but it is not wisdom itself." The conversation continued for hours, ranging across topics of knowledge, virtue, the nature of the soul, and the proper way to live. Athena found herself genuinely impressed by Socrates' intellectual honesty, his willingness to follow an argument wherever it led, his refusal to accept easy answers. But she also sensed something troubling in his approach. There was a relentlessness to his questioning, a refusal to accept that some things might be beyond human understanding. He seemed to believe that all truth could be discovered through rational inquiry, that the right questions could unlock any mystery. "Tell me, Socrates," she said as the sun began to set, "do you believe that the gods exist?" It was a dangerous question in Athens, where impiety was punishable by death, but Socrates answered with characteristic honesty. "I believe that there are divine forces in the world, powers greater than human understanding. But I confess that I do not understand their nature, and I am suspicious of anyone who claims to know the mind of the gods with certainty." "And yet," Athena pressed, "you continue to seek knowledge, as if all truth were within mortal reach. Do you not think there are some things that mortals are not meant to know?" Socrates was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the ground. When he looked up, there was something different in his expression, a recognition, perhaps, of who he was really talking to. "I think," he said slowly, "that it is human nature to seek understanding, even of things that may be beyond our grasp. The seeking itself has value, even if we never reach our goal. The examined life is worth living, even if the examination never ends." Athena studied his face carefully. Here was a mortal who had glimpsed something important about the nature of wisdom, that it was a process, not a destination, that the journey was more important than the arrival. But she also saw the potential danger in his philosophy. He was teaching young people to question everything, to trust nothing but their own reason, to reject traditional beliefs and authorities. This was admirable in many ways, but it was also subversive. It threatened the very foundations of social order, the respect for gods and traditions that kept society stable. Athena, as the goddess of wisdom, valued knowledge and understanding, but she also valued order, stability, the proper functioning of civilized society. "Be careful, Socrates," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of warning. "Questions can be dangerous things. They can undermine faith, destroy certainty, leave people lost and confused. Sometimes it is better to accept mystery than to probe too deeply." Socrates smiled, apparently unaware of the divine warning he had just received. "But grandmother, if we stop asking questions, how will we ever learn? How will we ever grow? How will we ever become better than we are?" Athena stood up, her disguise beginning to shimmer around the edges. "Perhaps," she said, "that is the question you should be asking yourself." She left him there in the agora, surrounded by his students, still asking questions, still seeking truth. But she carried with her a sense of unease, a feeling that something important was about to be lost. Years later, when Socrates was tried and executed by the city of Athens for corrupting the youth and impiety, Athena watched from Olympus with complicated feelings. She had valued his intellectual honesty, his commitment to truth, his recognition of his own limitations. But she also understood why the city had turned against him. He had been too uncompromising, too willing to tear down without building up, too focused on questions and not enough on answers. He had forgotten that wisdom was not just about understanding the world, but about living in it successfully. The grey-eyed goddess had learned something important from her encounter with Socrates, that pure intellectual inquiry, divorced from practical considerations, could be as dangerous as ignorance. That wisdom required not just the ability to ask questions, but the judgment to know when to stop asking them. She would remember this lesson in her future dealings with mortals, understanding that her role was not just to promote knowledge, but to help people find the right balance between curiosity and acceptance, between seeking truth and living peacefully with mystery. The philosopher's death marked the end of an era, but it also reminded Athena of something she had always known, that even the pursuit of wisdom could become a form of folly if taken to extremes. The path to understanding was narrow, bounded on one side by ignorance, and on the other by the kind of relentless questioning that destroyed more than it illuminated. The grey-eyed goddess would continue to guide mortals toward wisdom, but she would do so with a new understanding of its limitations and dangers. Not all questions were meant to be answered, and not all truths were meant to be known. Some stories begin with a choice, not a grand, obvious choice between good and evil, but a simple decision that seems insignificant at the time. The kind of choice that, looking back, makes you wonder how the entire world could have hinged on something so small. The story of the Trojan War, the greatest conflict in the ancient world, the event that would define Greek culture for centuries to come, began with exactly such a choice. And Athena, despite all her wisdom, found herself caught up in a contest that would reveal the deepest flaws in divine nature. It started with a wedding. Peleus, a mortal king, was marrying Thetis, a sea nymph. It should have been a joyous occasion, a celebration of love that brought together mortals and immortals in harmony. All the gods were invited to the ceremony, all except one. Eris, the goddess of discord, had been deliberately excluded from the guest list. She was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too likely to cause trouble at what was supposed to be a peaceful celebration. The other gods thought they were being clever, avoiding potential problems by simply not inviting the one deity who specialized in creating chaos. But Eris was not the kind of goddess who accepted slights quietly. She appeared at the wedding uninvited, carrying with her a golden apple. On its surface was inscribed a single phrase, "For the fairest." She rolled it into the middle of the celebration and disappeared, leaving the gods to discover her gift. The apple was beautiful beyond description, gleaming with otherworldly light, clearly meant for someone of extraordinary beauty. But who? 3 goddesses immediately stepped forward, each convinced that she was the rightful recipient. Hera, the queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, whose beauty was matched only by her power. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty itself, whose very presence could drive mortals to madness with desire. And Athena, the grey-eyed goddess, whose beauty was different from the others, more austere, more intellectual, but no less compelling. The argument that followed threatened to tear Olympus apart. Each goddess had supporters, each had reasons why she deserved the apple, each was absolutely convinced of her own superiority. Zeus, watching the conflict escalate, realized that he was facing a no-win situation. No matter which goddess he chose, the other 2 would become his enemies. No matter what he decided, the harmony of Olympus would be shattered. So he made a decision that would change the course of history. He refused to choose at all. "This is not a decision for me to make," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of the king of the gods. "The apple is for the fairest, and I am hardly an impartial judge. Let a mortal decide, someone who can see clearly without the bias of personal relationships or political considerations." The choice fell to Paris, a young prince of Troy who was known for his beauty and his skill as a shepherd. He was tending his flocks on the slopes of Mount Ida when the 3 goddesses appeared before him, each radiating divine power, each demanding that he choose her as the fairest. Paris looked at the 3 goddesses and felt his mind reel. How could a mortal judge between beings of such power and beauty? How could he choose without destroying himself in the process? But the goddesses were not content to let him make his decision based on appearance alone. Each began to offer him bribes, gifts that would make him the most powerful and successful man in the world. Hera spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of queens. "Choose me, Paris, and I will make you the ruler of all Asia. You will have power beyond imagination, armies that will obey your every command, riches that will make the treasures of kings look like paupers' coins." It was a tempting offer. Paris was a prince, but a minor one, unlikely to inherit significant power. The prospect of ruling vast territories, of commanding the respect and fear of other kings, was almost irresistible. But Athena stepped forward, her grey eyes bright with intelligence. "Power without wisdom is meaningless, Paris. Choose me, and I will give you something far more valuable than mere authority. I will make you the wisest man who ever lived, the greatest warrior, the most skilled in all the arts of war and peace. You will win every battle you fight, solve every problem you encounter, and be remembered as the greatest hero of your age." The offer was even more tempting. Paris was young, ambitious, eager to prove himself. The prospect of becoming a legendary hero, of achieving the kind of fame that would last forever, was almost overwhelming. But then Aphrodite spoke, and her voice was like honey, like the whisper of wind through flowers, like the sound of lovers' promises in the dark. Power fades, Paris. Fame is forgotten. But love is eternal. Choose me, and I will give you the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta, whose beauty makes men forget their own names, whose smile could launch 1,000 ships. She will be yours, completely and forever. Paris was young, and he was a man, and he was looking at the goddess of love herself. The choice he made in that moment would seem inevitable to anyone who understood human nature. But it was also the choice that would bring about the destruction of his city, the death of heroes, and the end of an age. He handed the golden apple to Aphrodite. Athena watched him make his choice and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She had offered him everything that she valued most: wisdom, skill, the respect of others, the satisfaction of achievement. She had offered him the chance to become the kind of person that gods themselves would admire. And he had chosen lust over wisdom, beauty over achievement, pleasure over excellence. The insult was not just personal, it was philosophical. It was a rejection of everything Athena represented, everything she believed was valuable and worthwhile. It was a statement that wisdom was less important than passion, that intelligence was less desirable than physical beauty. Hera's rage was immediate and obvious. She stormed off in a fury, already planning revenge against Paris and his entire city. But Athena's anger was deeper, more complex. She had been rejected, not just as a goddess, but as a principle. Her very essence had been found wanting by a mortal shepherd. The consequences of Paris's choice began to unfold almost immediately. Inspired by Aphrodite's promise, he traveled to Sparta and seduced Helen away from her husband Menelaus. The abduction, or elopement, depending on your perspective, provided the spark that would ignite the Trojan War. But for Athena, the war was not just about rescuing Helen or punishing Paris. It was about proving that wisdom was superior to beauty, that intelligence was more powerful than love, that the values she represented were worth more than the shallow pleasures that had swayed Paris's judgment. She would support the Greeks, not just because they were fighting against Troy, but because they were fighting against the choice that Paris had made. Every victory they won would be a vindication of her philosophy. Every defeat would be a reminder of the cost of choosing poorly. The grey-eyed goddess had learned something important about the nature of divine pride. She had thought herself above the petty jealousies that affected other gods, had believed that her wisdom made her immune to the kind of emotional reactions that drove Hera to fury or Aphrodite to manipulation. But she was wrong. The judgment of Paris had revealed that even the goddess of wisdom was susceptible to wounded pride, that even she could be driven to terrible actions by the sting of rejection. The war that followed would be the bloodiest in ancient history, a conflict that would consume heroes and mortals alike. And at its heart would be 3 goddesses, each fighting to prove that she deserved a golden apple, each willing to sacrifice thousands of lives to settle a question of vanity. The golden apple of discord had done its work perfectly. It had revealed the flaws in divine nature, the petty jealousies and wounded pride that even the gods could not overcome, and it had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the ancient world. Athena looked down at the armies gathering for war, at the ships being prepared for the journey to Troy, at the heroes who would die for the sake of divine honor. She felt the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that her own wounded pride was part of what had brought this catastrophe about. But she also felt the fire of determination. She would prove that wisdom was superior to beauty, that intelligence was more powerful than love. No matter what it cost, no matter how many lives were lost, she would vindicate her honor and her principles. The grey-eyed goddess was going to war. The ships stretched across the horizon, like a dark line drawn between sea and sky. 1,000 vessels, maybe more, carrying the greatest army the world had ever seen. They had come from every corner of Greece, united by oath and honor and the promise of glory. Kings and heroes, warriors and common soldiers, all bound together by a single purpose: to retrieve Helen and punish Troy for its crimes. But the gods watching from Olympus knew that this was about more than a stolen woman. This was about pride, about honor, about the cosmic order itself. The judgment of Paris had set forces in motion that could not be stopped, and now the only question was which side would prove stronger. Athena stood at the prow of the lead ship, invisible to mortal eyes, but present nonetheless. She had chosen her champions carefully: Odysseus for his cunning, Diomedes for his courage, Achilles for his unmatched skill in battle. Each represented a different aspect of her philosophy, a different way that wisdom could manifest in the world. The siege began simply enough. The Greek forces landed on the shores of Troy, established their camp, and began the long process of trying to break through the city's legendary walls. These were not ordinary fortifications. They had been built by the gods themselves, designed to withstand any earthly assault. For 9 years the war raged. Heroes fell on both sides, their stories becoming the stuff of legend. Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, fought with the nobility and honor that marked him as a true hero. Achilles, the mightiest of the Greeks, raged across the battlefield like a force of nature, his anger so terrible that it seemed to shake the very ground. But through it all, Athena was there, guiding her champions, whispering strategy, ensuring that wisdom would ultimately triumph over mere strength or passion. She was there when Diomedes, filled with divine courage, actually wounded Ares himself in battle. The god of war had taken physical form to fight alongside the Trojans, reveling in the chaos and bloodshed. But Athena had guided her champion spear, and the point had found its mark. Ares' screams of pain and rage had echoed across the battlefield as he fled back to Olympus, nursing his wounds. It was a moment of triumph for Athena, proof that intelligence and skill could overcome even divine power when properly applied. But it was also a reminder of how deeply the gods had become involved in mortal affairs, how their own conflicts were being played out through human proxies. She was there when Paris finally faced Menelaus in single combat, the 2 men fighting for the right to claim Helen. It should have been a decisive moment, a chance to end the war through individual courage rather than mass slaughter. But when Menelaus began to win, when it became clear that Paris was about to die, Aphrodite intervened, spiriting her champion away in a cloud of mist. Athena watched this divine interference with cold fury. Here was proof of what she had known all along, that Paris was a coward, that Aphrodite's gift was built on deception and weakness. A true hero would have faced death with honor rather than accept divine rescue. But the war continued, and the death toll mounted. Both sides were growing weary of the conflict, but neither was willing to admit defeat. The Greeks had too much invested in the siege to simply sail home empty-handed. The Trojans had too much pride to surrender their city and their honor. It was then that Athena began to work on the plan that would end the war. She had been watching Odysseus throughout the conflict, admiring his ability to think strategically, to see solutions that others missed. He was not the strongest warrior or the most skilled fighter, but he understood something that many of his companions did not, that wars were won by intelligence, not just by courage. The idea came to him during a sleepless night, as he paced the shores of the Trojan beach and listened to the waves. The walls of Troy were too strong to break, but what if they didn't have to break them? What if they could find a way to make the Trojans open the gates themselves? When he brought the idea to Athena, she smiled for the first time in months. Here was the kind of thinking she had been waiting for, the application of wisdom to an impossible problem. The wooden horse they designed together was a masterpiece of deception. Large enough to hold a significant number of warriors, but hollow inside, with carefully concealed compartments. It would be built by the greatest craftsmen in the Greek army, made to look like an offering to the gods, a symbol of the Greeks' admission of defeat. The plan required perfect timing and absolute trust. The main Greek fleet would sail away, apparently abandoning the siege. Only the horse would remain, along with a single Greek soldier who would claim to be a deserter. This man would tell the Trojans that the horse was an offering to Athena, designed to ensure the Greeks' safe journey home. But he would also tell them something else, that the horse was deliberately made too large to fit through the gates of Troy, because the Greeks knew that if it were brought inside the city, it would bring divine protection to Troy itself. It was a perfect piece of reverse psychology, calculated to make the Trojans want to bring the horse inside their walls. Athena watched as the plan unfolded exactly as she had envisioned. The Greeks built the horse, selected their bravest warriors to hide inside it, and sailed away, leaving only the wooden offering on the beach. The Trojans, after much debate, decided to bring it inside the city as a trophy of their victory. That night, as Troy celebrated what they thought was the end of the war, the hidden warriors emerged from their wooden prison. They opened the gates for the returning Greek fleet, and the final battle began. The sack of Troy was terrible in its completeness. The city that had withstood siege for 10 years fell in a single night. King Priam was killed at the altar of his own palace. Hector's infant son was thrown from the walls. The women of Troy were taken as slaves, the men slaughtered, the city burned to the ground. Athena watched it all from the walls of the burning city, her grey eyes reflecting the flames. She had achieved her goal. Wisdom had triumphed over beauty, intelligence over passion. The judgment of Paris had been answered with fire and sword. But as she looked down at the destruction, at the bodies of heroes and innocents alike, she felt something she had not expected, a hollow sense of victory. Yes, she had proven her point. Yes, she had vindicated her honor. But at what cost? The city below her had been one of the greatest in the ancient world, a center of culture and learning. Now it was nothing but ash and ruin. The heroes who had made the war legendary were dead. Their stories ended in violence and tragedy. The women and children who had played no part in the original conflict were suffering for the pride of gods and kings. For the first time in her existence, Athena began to question whether wisdom without mercy was truly wise at all. She had wanted to prove that intelligence was superior to beauty, that strategic thinking was more valuable than emotional appeals. But the proof had required the destruction of an entire civilization, the deaths of countless innocents, the reduction of a magnificent city to rubble. The grey-eyed goddess stood in the ruins of Troy and wondered if this was what victory was supposed to feel like. She had won, but the taste of triumph was bitter in her mouth. The war was over, but its consequences would echo through history. The age of heroes was ending, and a new era was beginning, one that would be shaped by the knowledge of what divine pride could accomplish when it was unleashed upon the world. Athena looked one last time at the burning city, then turned away. She had learned something important about the nature of wisdom, that it was not enough to be right. It was not enough to win. True wisdom required understanding the full cost of victory and accepting responsibility for the consequences of one's actions. The grey-eyed goddess had proven her point, but she had also learned that some victories were more devastating than any defeat. The war was over, but the gods' anger was not. As the Greek ships prepared to sail home, heavy with Trojan treasure and captive women, Athena found herself grappling with emotions she had rarely experienced before. The victory she had worked so hard to achieve felt hollow, tainted by the memories of what it had cost. But it was not just regret that filled her heart. It was rage, cold, calculating, and utterly implacable. The Greeks had won the war, but in their moment of triumph, they had committed acts that went beyond the acceptable violence of warfare. They had desecrated temples, murdered suppliants who had sought sanctuary, and shown contempt for the very gods who had given them victory. The worst offense had been committed by Ajax the Lesser, son of Oileus. In the final sack of Troy, he had pursued Cassandra, the Trojan prophetess, into Athena's own temple. The girl had clung to the statue of the goddess, claiming the protection that was guaranteed to all suppliants. But Ajax had dragged her away, defiling both the sacred space and the girl herself. It was an act of such brazen sacrilege that even the other Greeks had been horrified. But Ajax had laughed at their protests, drunk on victory and blood, convinced that his role in the Greek triumph made him untouchable. He was wrong. Athena had watched the violation of her temple with eyes that burned like cold fire. She had given the Greeks victory, had guided their strategies, had protected their champions. This was how they repaid her, with contempt, with sacrilege, with the kind of hubris that demanded divine retribution. But she would not strike in the heat of the moment. She was the goddess of wisdom after all, and wisdom required patience, planning, and the perfect application of justice. She would wait until the Greeks were at their most vulnerable, when they thought themselves safe, when they had forgotten that divine power could reach them anywhere. She would wait until they were at sea. The Greek fleet set sail from Troy's ruined shores on a bright morning, the wind filling their sails, the sun warming their faces. The war was over. Their enemies were defeated, and they were going home as heroes. The ships were heavy with treasure, the men were singing victory songs, and the future seemed bright with promise. But Athena was watching from the clouds, and her patience was at an end. She began by speaking to Poseidon, her uncle, the god of the sea. Their relationship had been complicated since their contest for Athens, but they shared a common outrage at the Greeks' behavior. Poseidon had his own grievances. His temples had been violated, his priests killed, his sacred rites interrupted by the violence of war. "The Greeks have forgotten their place," Athena said, her voice carrying the chill of winter storms. "They think that victory gives them the right to insult the gods. They need to be reminded that mortal success is always temporary, always dependent on divine favor." Poseidon's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "What do you propose, niece?" "A storm," she said simply. "Not just any storm, but a tempest that will scatter their fleet, that will remind them of their mortality, that will teach them the cost of hubris." The god of the sea smiled grimly. "It will be my pleasure." The storm they unleashed was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. It struck the Greek fleet without warning, turning calm seas into chaos, bright skies into darkness. Ships that had survived 10 years of war were smashed against rocks. torn apart by winds that screamed with divine fury. The carefully organized fleet was scattered across the Mediterranean, individual ships fighting desperately for survival. Some were driven onto hostile shores, their crews enslaved or killed by the very enemies they had once defeated. Others were lost entirely, swallowed by waves that towered higher than city walls. Athena watched it all with satisfaction, but her rage was not yet satisfied. She had particular plans for Ajax the Lesser, the man who had dared to violate her temple. She would not let him die quickly in the storm. That would be too merciful. Instead, she would let him survive just long enough to understand the magnitude of his offense. Ajax's ship was driven onto a rocky island, its hull split open by the impact. Most of his crew drowned immediately, but Ajax himself managed to climb onto a tall rock that jutted from the sea. He stood there, battered by wind and spray, watching his ship break apart on the rocks below. But even in the face of divine wrath, Ajax remained defiant. He raised his fist to the storm-dark sky and shouted his challenge to the gods. "You cannot kill me," he bellowed, his voice barely audible above the wind. "I am Ajax, son of Oileus. I took Troy despite you, and I'll survive this storm despite you. I need no help from gods." It was exactly the kind of hubris that Athena had been waiting for. She appeared to him then, not in disguise, but in her full divine glory, her armor blazing with lightning, her eyes burning with cold fire. "You need no help from gods?" she asked, her voice cutting through the storm like a sword. "Then you shall have none." She raised her hand, and lightning split the sky. The bolt struck the rock where Ajax stood, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The man who had violated her temple, who had laughed at divine authority, who had thought himself above the laws that governed mortals, fell into the churning sea and disappeared beneath the waves. But Athena's vengeance extended beyond individual punishment. She had decided that the age of heroes was over, that the time had come for mortals to learn humility. The storm she had unleashed was not just about punishing the Greeks for their crimes at Troy. It was about ending an era, about making it clear that the days when mortals could stand as equals with gods were finished. Many of the greatest heroes of the war never made it home. Those who did survive found their kingdoms in chaos, their families scattered, their reputations tarnished by the disasters that had befallen them. The glory they had won at Troy was overshadowed by the suffering they had endured on the journey home. Even Odysseus, her own chosen champion, would spend 10 years wandering the seas, facing challenges that would test not just his courage, but his very sanity. She did not abandon him entirely. Their relationship was too important for that. But she let him struggle, let him learn through hardship that divine favor was not something to be taken for granted. The message was clear. Mortals who forgot their place, who treated the gods with contempt, who thought that victory in war gave them the right to do whatever they pleased, would face consequences that would echo through generations. But as Athena watched the destruction she had wrought, she felt once again the complicated emotions that had become her burden. She had been right to punish the Greeks for their sacrilege, right to remind them of their mortality, right to end an age that had become too proud and too violent. Yet something had changed in her as well. The goddess who had once delighted in the clash of bronze and the clever strategies of mortal heroes now found herself questioning the very nature of the conflicts she had helped to create. She had ended the age of heroes, but in doing so, she had also ended something in herself. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls as if the very flames were acting out the drama of gods and mortals. For in truth, dear listener, This was not the end of Athena's story, but perhaps the beginning of her most complex chapter. The centuries that followed the Trojan War brought a different kind of challenge to the grey-eyed goddess. As the age of heroes faded into memory, mortals began to change. They built cities not just for protection, but for beauty. They asked questions not just about how to win wars, but about how to live well. They sought wisdom not just for survival, but for understanding. And they came to Athens. In Athens, her beloved city, philosophers gathered in the shade of olive trees to debate the nature of justice, truth, and virtue. They built schools and libraries, temples dedicated not to war, but to learning. They created art that captured not just the physical world, but the realm of ideas itself. These new mortals didn't seek the goddess's help in battle as much as they sought her guidance in thought. They wanted to understand the world around them, to uncover the principles that governed both the natural world and human society. They were, in many ways, trying to become more like her, wise, thoughtful, measured in their judgments. But wisdom, as Athena was beginning to understand, was not always a blessing. There was a young philosopher named Arachne, who lived in the mountains above Athens. She was brilliant, perhaps too brilliant for her own good. She had studied the old stories, had learned the names and deeds of all the gods, and had begun to see patterns that others missed. The gods, she would tell her students, are not so different from us. They feel anger, jealousy, love, and fear. They make mistakes. They can be petty, cruel, even foolish. If we are to be wise, we must see them as they truly are, not as the priests would have us believe. It was dangerous talk, but it was also accurate. Athena found herself listening to these discussions with a mixture of pride and unease. Here was a mortal who truly understood the nature of divine psychology, who could see through the myths and legends to the complex beings beneath. It was exactly the kind of wisdom Athena had always valued. But wisdom without reverence was a dangerous thing. Arachne's teachings spread. Soon, young people throughout Greece were questioning the old stories, analyzing the behavior of gods with the same critical eye they might use to examine a philosophical argument. They were learning to think, yes, but they were also learning to judge. And gods, Athena realized, did not always stand up well to mortal judgment. The crisis came during the festival of Pantheon, Athens' greatest celebration in honor of their patron goddess. It was a time when the city came together to offer sacrifices, to compete in games, to celebrate the wisdom and protection Athena had given them. But this year, something was different. As the procession wound its way up to the Acropolis, Athena could hear the conversations of the participants. They were not speaking of her with simple reverence, but with analysis, criticism, even mockery. She destroyed the Greek fleet because one man offended her, one young man was saying. Thousands died because of her wounded pride. Is this wisdom? And what of Medusa? Added his companion. She punished the victim of rape instead of the rapist. What justice is that? The words hit Athena like physical blows. These mortals, these students of philosophy who claimed to seek wisdom, were using that very wisdom to tear down the foundations of divine authority. They were applying human standards of justice to divine actions and finding those actions wanting. She wanted to be angry. Every instinct told her to appear in her full glory, to remind these upstart mortals of their place, to show them the same kind of wrath she had shown to Ajax and the other Greeks. But she found she could not, because, in her heart, she knew they were right. The realization was devastating. She, the goddess of wisdom, had acted unwisely. She, the goddess of justice, had been unjust. She, who was supposed to guide mortals toward truth, had been driven by the same petty emotions that plagued the mortals themselves. For the first time in her long existence, Athena experienced something she had never felt before: shame. She withdrew from the world, retreating to the heights of Mount Olympus, where she could think, where she could try to understand what it meant to be wise when wisdom itself revealed your flaws. The other gods noticed her absence, but they were too caught up in their own affairs to pay much attention. Only her father, Zeus, seemed to understand what was happening to her. "You are learning," he said, when he found her sitting alone on the mountain peak, staring out at the world below. "It is painful, but it is necessary." "I have been a fool," she said quietly. "I have acted from pride, from anger, from wounded vanity. I have called myself wise while behaving like a spoiled child." Zeus nodded. "Yes, you have. We all have. But wisdom is not about never making mistakes, daughter. It is about learning from them." "How can I face those mortals again?" she asked. "How can I claim to be their guide when I have so much to learn myself?" "By being honest," Zeus replied. "By admitting your errors. By showing them that even gods can grow, can change, can become better than they were." It was advice that would reshape not just Athena's relationship with mortals, but the very nature of wisdom itself. The olive trees rustled in the evening breeze as Athena made her way through the streets of Athens. But this time, she came not as a goddess demanding worship, but as a seeker of understanding. She had taken the form of an elderly woman, unremarkable in appearance, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen much of the world. She found Arachne in the marketplace, engaged in one of her philosophical discussions with a group of young Athenians. The topic, ironically, was the nature of divine justice. "The gods," Arachne was saying, "act according to their nature, just as we do. But their nature is not necessarily just, any more than ours is. They are powerful, but power does not make one right." "But surely," one of her students protested, "there must be some divine standard of justice? Some perfect law that the gods uphold?" Arachne smiled sadly. "If there is, dear friend, they have hidden it well from us. We must make our own justice, find our own wisdom. We cannot rely on the gods to provide it for us." Athena felt a strange mixture of pride and sorrow at these words. Pride, because Arachne was demonstrating exactly the kind of independent thinking that wisdom required. Sorrow, because the philosopher was right. The gods had failed to provide the moral guidance that mortals needed. When the discussion ended and the crowd dispersed, Athena approached the young woman. "Your words are wise," she said, her voice carrying the weight of age. "But tell me, child, what would you do if you encountered a god who wished to learn from you?" Arachne looked at her with sharp, intelligent eyes. "I would treat them as I would any other student, grandmother. Truth is truth, regardless of who speaks it or who hears it. Even if that god had made terrible mistakes, even if they had acted unwisely, unjustly." "Especially then," Arachne replied, "for what is wisdom without the willingness to acknowledge error? What is justice without the courage to make amends?" Athena smiled, and for a moment her divine nature shone through her disguise. "Then perhaps you would be willing to teach such a god, if they came to you seeking wisdom?" Recognition dawned in Arachne's eyes, but there was no fear there, only curiosity. "Lady Athena," she said quietly, "you honor me with your presence. But I must ask, Why do you come to me? What could a mortal philosopher teach the goddess of wisdom? Everything, Athena replied, letting her disguise fall away. You could teach me how to be worthy of the title I bear. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary philosophical discussion in all of human history. Goddess and mortal sat together through the night, exploring questions that had puzzled both divine and human minds for millennia. They spoke of justice and mercy, of wisdom and folly, of the responsibility that comes with power. You cannot change the past, Arachne said as dawn approached. Medusa will always have suffered for Poseidon's crime. The Greek fleet will always have been destroyed by divine wrath. But you can choose how to act in the future. And how should I act? Athena asked. With humility, Arachne replied, with the understanding that wisdom is not a destination, but a journey, with the recognition that even gods can learn, can grow, can become better than they were. It was a conversation that would change both participants forever. Athena learned that true wisdom required not just knowledge, but the courage to admit ignorance. She learned that justice was not about punishment, but about restoration. She learned that her role was not to rule over mortals, but to guide them toward their own understanding. And Arachne? She learned that the gods were not enemies to be defeated or masters to be feared, but fellow travelers on the path toward wisdom. She learned that criticism and reverence were not opposites, but partners in the search for truth. When the sun rose over Athens, both goddess and mortal had been transformed. But their conversation was just the beginning. Word of the goddess's night-long discussion with Arachne spread through Athens like wildfire. Some were scandalized that a mortal would dare to instruct a goddess. Others were amazed that Athena had shown such humility. But most were simply curious about what this meant for their relationship with the divine. The answer came during the next festival of Panathenea, when Athena appeared before the assembled citizens of Athens, not as a distant deity to be worshipped, but as a teacher ready to learn alongside her students. "People of Athens," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd, "I have been your patron for many centuries. I have protected your city, guided your heroes, and shared my wisdom with your people. But I have also made mistakes, acted unwisely, and caused suffering through my own pride and anger." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. This was not the kind of speech they were used to hearing from the gods. "I cannot change the past," Athena continued, "but I can choose how to act in the future. I can choose to be the goddess you deserve, not the one you have had to endure. I can choose to learn from you, even as I teach you." She gestured to Arachne, who stood among the crowd with her students. "This woman has shown me that wisdom is not about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions. She has taught me that justice is not about punishment, but about understanding. She has reminded me that even gods can grow." The festival that followed was unlike any in Greek history. Instead of simply offering sacrifices and holding competitions, the Athenians engaged in philosophical discussions, debates about ethics and governance, and collaborative efforts to solve the problems facing their city. Athena participated not as a judge or arbiter, but as a fellow seeker of wisdom. She shared her knowledge freely, but also listened carefully to the insights of mortals. She offered guidance, but also asked for advice. She had become, in the truest sense, a teacher who was willing to learn. This new approach to divinity spread beyond Athens. Other cities began to see their gods differently, not as distant powers to be feared or placated, but as partners in the ongoing work of creating a just and wise society. The relationship between divine and mortal began to evolve from one of domination and submission to one of mutual respect and collaboration. But not everyone was pleased with these changes. Some of the other gods viewed Athena's transformation with suspicion and alarm. They worried that her example would undermine divine authority, that mortals would become too bold if they believed they could question and instruct the gods. The tension came to a head during a gathering of the Olympic Pantheon. Ares, still smarting from his ancient defeats at Athena's hands, was the first to voice his objections. "Sister," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "you make us all look weak. Mortals are meant to serve and worship, not to instruct and question. By showing them such humility, you encourage them to forget their place." "And what place is that?" Athena asked calmly. "Beneath us? Afraid of us? Ignorant of the very wisdom we claim to possess?" "Yes!" Ares exploded. "That is exactly their place. We are gods. We are supposed to be above their petty concerns, their small understanding." Other gods murmured agreement, but Athena noticed that some remained silent, thoughtful. Her father, Zeus, watched the debate with keen interest, but did not intervene. "Brother," Athena said, "what you call strength, I call weakness. What you call authority, I call tyranny. A god who cannot bear to be questioned is a god who has forgotten what it means to be wise." The debate raged for hours, with the Pantheon splitting into factions. Some, led by Ares, argued for maintaining the old ways, the old distance between divine and mortal. Others, inspired by Athena's example, began to consider new approaches to their relationships with humanity. In the end, it was Zeus who settled the matter, but not in the way anyone expected. "Each of you," he said, his voice carrying the authority of the sky itself, "must choose your own path. There is no single way to be a god, just as there is no single way to be mortal. Athena has chosen wisdom and humility. Ares prefers strength and authority. Both have their place in the world." It was a decision that would reshape the nature of Greek religion. Some gods continued to demand unquestioning worship, while others embraced the new model of partnership with mortals. Some cities maintained traditional religious practices, while others adopted more philosophical approaches to the divine. But the most significant change was in Athena herself. She had discovered that true wisdom was not about having all the answers, but about being willing to ask new questions. She had learned that justice was not about punishment, but about understanding and growth. She had found that her greatest strength lay not in her power to command, but in her ability to inspire. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. Athens grew and prospered under Athena's transformed guidance, becoming not just a military power, but a center of learning, philosophy, and art. The city's schools and libraries attracted students from across the Mediterranean world, all seeking the wisdom that came from the unique partnership between goddess and mortals. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the nature of that wisdom itself. It was no longer something handed down from on high, but something discovered through dialogue, debate, and mutual exploration. Athena had learned to be not just a teacher, but a student. Her mortal followers had learned to be not just worshippers, but participants in the ongoing quest for understanding. The transformation was most visible in the way conflicts were resolved. Where once Athena might have simply imposed her will or unleashed her wrath, she now worked with mortals to find solutions that honored both divine wisdom and human understanding. Wars were still fought, but they were fought with greater consideration of their consequences. Justice was still administered, but it was tempered with mercy and understanding. The changes were not without their challenges. Some mortals, accustomed to clear divine commands, struggled with the new expectation that they think for themselves. Some gods, watching Athena's example, began to question their own approaches to divinity. The old certainties were giving way to new complexities. But out of this complexity came a richer, more nuanced understanding of both human and divine nature. Philosophers like Socrates and Plato would later build upon the foundation that Athena and her mortal partners had laid, creating systems of thought that would influence human civilization for millennia to come. Athena herself continued to evolve. She learned to see her past mistakes not as failures to be hidden, but as lessons to be shared. She spoke openly about her errors in judgment, her moments of pride and wrath, using her own experiences to teach others about the dangers of unchecked power and uncritical thinking. The story of Medusa, once a source of shame for the goddess, became a teaching tale about the importance of understanding all sides of a situation before rendering judgment. The destruction of the Greek fleet after Troy became a lesson about the difference between justice and revenge. Even her ancient rivalry with Poseidon was reframed as an example of how competition could be transformed into collaboration. But perhaps the most profound change was in how Athena understood her own nature. She had always been the goddess of wisdom, but she had thought of wisdom as a static quality, something to be possessed rather than pursued. Now she understood that wisdom was dynamic, always growing, always questioning, always open to new understanding. She had been the goddess of war, but she had thought of war as simply the application of strategy and strength. Now she understood that true victory came not from defeating enemies, but from finding ways to transform conflict into cooperation, opposition into dialogue. She had been the goddess of justice, but she had thought of justice as the rigid application of divine law. Now she understood that justice was a living thing, something that had to be constantly renewed and refined through the interaction of divine wisdom and human experience. As the classical age of Greece reached its height, Athena looked out over her beloved Athens with a mixture of pride and humility. The city had become everything she had hoped for, and more, a place where wisdom flourished, where justice was pursued with both passion and restraint, where mortals and gods could work together as partners in the great endeavor of civilization. But she also knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. Wisdom was not a destination to be reached, but a journey to be continued. Each generation would face new challenges, ask new questions, and require new forms of understanding. Her role was not to provide final answers, but to continue asking the questions that would lead to greater wisdom. The gray-eyed goddess had learned the most important lesson of all, that true wisdom lay not in knowing everything, but in never stopping the quest to learn more. The fire burns lower now, dear listener, its flames dancing with the shadows of a story that spans millennia. For though the golden age of Athens would eventually pass, though empires would rise and fall, though the very names of the gods would fade from common memory, the wisdom that Athena had learned and taught would endure. In the closing years of the classical world, as Rome expanded its dominion and Greek influence waned, Athena found herself facing a new kind of challenge. The world was changing, and with it, the role of the gods themselves. New religions were emerging, new philosophies were taking root, and the old certainties were giving way to unfamiliar possibilities. But instead of clinging to the past, Athena embraced change with the same curiosity and humility she had learned from her mortal teachers. She watched as the wisdom of Athens spread throughout the Roman world, influencing law, philosophy, and governance. She saw how the questions that had first been asked in the olive groves of Attica continued to be explored in libraries and schools across the Mediterranean. The goddess who had once demanded worship now took quiet satisfaction in seeing her true gifts: wisdom, justice, and the courage to ask difficult questions, living on in the work of mortals who might never know her name. She had learned that immortality was not about being remembered, but about the ideas and principles that outlive any individual, mortal or divine. When the last temple dedicated to her was closed, when the final priest spoke her name in prayer, Athena did not rage or despair. Instead, she smiled, understanding that the true temple of wisdom was not built of marble and gold, but of thoughts and questions, of the eternal human quest to understand the world and their place in it. She had become something new, not the distant, demanding goddess of ancient myth, but the eternal guardian of the principle that knowledge must be earned, that justice must be pursued, that wisdom must be constantly renewed. She was present wherever mortals gathered to learn, to debate, to question, to grow. In the medieval monasteries where monks preserved ancient texts, she was there. In the Renaissance workshops where artists and scientists pushed the boundaries of human knowledge, she was there. In the modern universities where students and teachers continue the ancient dialogue between ignorance and understanding, she is there still. The grey-eyed goddess had learned the ultimate lesson, that true immortality lay not in being worshipped, but in being embodied, in the countless mortals who carry forward the principles of wisdom, justice, and thoughtful inquiry that she had come to represent. And perhaps, dear listener, she is here with us now, in this quiet moment as we sit together by the fire, sharing stories and seeking understanding. For wherever curiosity meets humility, wherever questions are asked with genuine desire to learn, wherever the pursuit of wisdom takes precedence over the assertion of power, there you will find the true spirit of Athena. The goddess of wisdom had learned that the greatest victory was not in battle, but in the transformation of conflict into collaboration, ignorance into understanding, and pride into wisdom. She had discovered that the most enduring justice was not punishment, but the patient work of building a better world, one question at a time. Her story, like all the best stories, has no true ending. Only the quiet promise that the quest for wisdom will continue, that new generations will ask new questions, and that somewhere, in the space between knowing and unknowing, the grey-eyed goddess still watches, still learns, and still guides those who seek truth with humble hearts. The fire has burned down to embers now, casting a gentle glow across the room where we've sat together through this long night of stories. The tale of Athena, goddess of wisdom, war, and ultimately, transformation, has wound its way through centuries of myth and meaning, showing us not just the power of the divine, but the profound capacity for growth that exists in all conscious beings. We've seen her journey from the fierce warrior goddess who sprang fully formed from Zeus's head to the humble teacher who learned wisdom from her own students. We've watched her evolve from the divine arbiter who punished with swift and terrible justice to the patient guide who understood that true justice grows from understanding, not vengeance. Her story reminds us that wisdom is not a destination, but a journey, one that requires the courage to question our own assumptions, the humility to admit our mistakes, and the patience to keep learning from everyone we meet, mortal or divine. As the last embers fade and the night draws to its close, perhaps you'll carry with you something of Athena's transformed spirit, that endless curiosity, that willingness to grow, that understanding that the greatest strength lies not in always having the answers, but in never stopping the search for truth. If this tale has stirred something in you, if you felt the warmth of this fireside gathering, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like and subscribe. There are countless more stories waiting to be told, more legends to explore, more wisdom to discover together. Until then, rest well, dear listener. Let the quiet wisdom of the grey-eyed goddess watch over your dreams, and know that when you are ready for the next tale, I'll be here by the fire, waiting to share another story from the vast treasury of human imagination. Sweet dreams, and may your own quest for wisdom be as transformative as Athena's own.